This recording is protected by copyright. No part may be reproduced without the prior permission of the University of South Australia.
Welcome, this is the Queer Voices session. You're in the right place? Okay. The first of our speakers is Dino Hodge. Dino's publications include the oral history books Did You Meet Any Malagas? On Darwin's Gay Community and The Fall Upwards, about spirituality in the lives of lesbian women and gay men. He is co-editor of You Don't Get Degrees in Weet-Bix Boxes. That's an interesting title. A secondary school social studies text on Indigenous people's experience in education. He recently completed a PhD documenting homophobia in South Australian social policy during the 20th century, and is presently writing a book about former South Australian Premier Don Dunstan entitled, I think I've got this right, Don Dunstan, A Political Biography. Intimacy and Liberty. Oh, that's even better. Would you please welcome Dino Hodge?
Good morning. Can everyone hear me okay? Yep, good, thank you. 2 years ago, I presented a paper to the South Australian History Conference describing police persecution of the homosexual culture in South Australia during the 1950s and 60s. My paper drew upon police files, the government records, cabinet papers, and newspaper reports of the period to explain the motivations behind that police campaign. I also analysed a unique body of oral history interviews to detail the method of police persecution, including use of informants, entrapment, verballing, coercion, and assault. An audience member kindly raised a question about how we could know that the oral history record is reliable. Today, I look at some of the ways the question of reliability can be assessed, and additionally I seek to contextualise the interviewee, the historian-interviewer, and the impact of prevailing historical assumptions. In 1979, an article appeared in Adelaide's gay community newspaper, Gay Changes, encouraging men to participate in a project being initiated by John Lee, a sociology and history graduate of Flinders University. He intended to write a book on the history of Adelaide's homosexual community from the 1920s to the 1970s. Lee told interviewees, quote, "The aim of the project is certainly not to provide anything resembling a sensationalised, scandalous tale for the titillation of non-homosexual readers. On the contrary, I will be aiming for a highly sympathetic, readable, lively, and most of all, accurate account of the various ways in which homosexual people have lived in Adelaide. In short, as close as possible to the true story of Adelaide's homosexual community. Obviously, information from records such as parliamentary papers, newspaper reports, etc. must be woven into the story, but it is also clear that this can only be of very limited value in capturing the realities of the homosexual experience. Rather, information must come from the memories of people." Lee later expanded that diaries and letters are unfortunately not a ready source because secrecy until quite recently has been all important in the homosexual world. Risk of discovery and exposure, he said, through a written record, even after one's death, was a pervasive fear. Lee recorded interviews with 42 people, being one woman and the remainder homosexual men. He subsequently relocated to Sydney, where he presented a paper on his work at the University of Sydney. Lee still unfortunately hadn't published his research before his untimely death in 1991. A short essay on Adelaide's homosexual culture in the period leading up to World War II, drawing upon Lee's paper, was prepared by his friends and published the following year. My analysis of the Lee interviews finds that police activities during the pre-war period are occasionally remarked upon. In dramatic contrast, however, accounts of police activities during the post-war period dominate many interviews, and in some instances, entire interviews consist solely of accounts of police abuse of powers and their consequences. The interviewee's self-reflection about their lives in the pre-war period reveals an awareness of participating in an underground culture. In distinction, the sense of self in the post-war period is characterised by an acute sense of persecution. The interviews reveal that persecution began with a period of particularly intense police activity during 1948 to 52, referred to by some interviewees as the Blitz. One interviewee, Keith, recounts, quote, that it had repercussions for a long while after that. People weren't game to show themselves anywhere because you were hounded and kept down all the time. Robin relates of the early 1960s, quote, that people used to get picked up, 8 or 9 of them a night, and they used to publish them in the paper. That's picked up by the police and taken in and interviewed and names taken down, that sort of thing. Peter A. describes, there was nothing you could do. Once you were caught, it was just this frightful fear hanging over your head of being caught. Because, of course, as you realise, everybody still did it. You couldn't be unnatural enough not to do it. Oh, it would hang over everybody, because it wasn't just a handful of people. There were hundreds and thousands of people in Adelaide at that time who were camp. So to what extent can interviewees' testimonies be regarded as reliable? Oral history is subjective to the vagaries of memory, with some events and times being recalled more accurately than others. Dramatic incidents can be emphasised, while the ordinary is forgotten. Lee's interviewees, however, do recall the ordinary, and they reveal the daily lives that constituted the flowering of Adelaide's homosexual culture during the post-war years. But the interviewees also recalled the extraordinary. And in regard to the commentary about police and post-war persecution, the Lee interviews demonstrate a degree of internal consistency that is quite remarkable. They provide a uniform outlook that the pre-war experiences of policing were in contrast to the post-war experiences, and moreover, that the post-war policing was believed to be thoroughly systematic and deliberately traumatic. In any historian's work, there's always a moment of satisfaction when a story known only through the oral record is subsequently substantiated elsewhere. One Lee interviewee discusses the dismissal from Government House in the pre-war years of a butler who, in the absence of his employers, would hold drag parties making use of the wardrobe belonging to the governor's wife. So you can imagine my reaction when at State Records I came across a police file dated 1932, nearly 60 years before the interview was recorded. The file was innocuously entitled Parties Given by Peter Rollo at Government House. Well, you know, no one would think to look at a file like that, but actually it contained documentary evidence that provided new information about newspaper reports and the police management of the situation of this party and the butler, or the parties. There was more than one. And had the incident not been discussed in the oral record, then I doubt that anyone would ever bother to look at this police file. Entrapment appears to have been regularly practiced by the South Australian Vice Squad in at least one other area of their work. In 1958, the squad's officer in charge, Sergeant Giles, wrote to his superiors seeking an increase for their living expenses. He argued that the squad was detecting breaches of the Licensing Act by means of male and female plainclothes police entering suspect premises to purchase meals and liquor during prohibited hours. The Vice Squad, he argued, needed extra money to cover excessive wining and dining expenditure incurred in the course of their duties. I think they were having a good time. They were out there. But the memo establishes that the practice of entrapment was known and endorsed within the police hierarchy. And this is one of the key ways that the police also targeted the homosexual culture. So we can find sources of information that corroborate or are at least parallel insights into the way that police were operating in other cultures. And we can find that the experiences of violence are, of people at the hands of the police are reported in a separate oral record. So we have interactions between the police and Nungas, Indigenous South Australians, that are being discussed in the landmark book Survival in Our Own Land. An entire, if brief, chapter describes the dynamics of this interaction and provides details of police actions similar to those experienced by homosexual citizens, including harassment and intimidation, assault, arbitrary arrest, falsified statements and charges, as well as inadequate internal investigation of complaints against police. Importantly, the Lee interviews are complemented and substantiated by opinions and documentation external to the South Australian homosexual culture. The interviews are congruent with accounts describing police engagement during this period with the homosexual culture in other Australian states. Wotherspoon discusses the details of the situation in Sydney and New South Wales. Moore discusses the events in Queensland, and Willett describes the Victorian experience and draws all of these accounts together with a national perspective. And more recently, there are new oral history interviews that I have conducted. One interview is with a former policeman, Mick O'Shea, who joined the South Australian Vice Squad as a young man in 1971. He became entangled in the aftermath of the 1972 murder of university law lecturer Dr. George Duncan. Quote, "You could put in a brief about 2 or 3 blokes loitering, failed to give satisfactory account, and if you dragged one aside and treated him the right way, like giving him a biffing, he might admit to buggery. The Vice Squad didn't have to be coy about it, because they were hardly ever likely to be called to court and challenged, because the guys would just want to nod their scones and get out of there." Why we had to have this afternoon shift of half-hour funny man stories in the Vice Squad office about the previous night's activities in luring homosexuals out of the toilets or otherwise in the parklands and belt the fuck out of them, or down the river just flicking them in, it was a huge game. It was just a huge game. This is O'Shea here. So I've written more about O'Shea elsewhere, but I'm not going to talk too much more about it. But I will continue on to say that O'Shea's estimation of the police activities amounted to little more than a huge game is not shared by Mark Day, who in the early 1960s worked as a newspaper reporter assigned to police rounds. Day recalls at that time that police assaults on homosexual men were a regular event and, quote, that these things took place and nobody was surprised because everybody knew they did. However, by the time of Dr. Duncan's murder, Mark Day was editor of Adelaide's weekly Sunday Mail, and in this capacity he worked to ensure that the murder remained front page news. We were chasing the cops. The cops were in our frame. Not George Duncan was a homosexual and had been bashed. That wasn't the story. The story was the cops who got away with it. That the culture was as guilty as sin was taken as read. Proving it was an entirely different matter. There can be little doubt that the Lee interviews and the accounts that they provide of police practices have considerable reliability, but it is a question of how do you prove it. We all come to history with our individual interests and bias. John Lee was an early convert to Marxist liberation philosophy and gay activism. In his interviews, he wanted to explore the impact on the homosexual culture of gay liberation and the importance of coming out. In doing so, he almost inadvertently documented one of the worst instances of Australian police persecution in the 20th century. Lee's interviews reveal that a situation that for many outside the homosexual culture would seem improbable and indeed unimaginable. But for me, one of Lee's greatest fans, I sense missing truths. One could be mistaken in assuming that lesbian culture was quite limited. The few instances when women's experiences are raised are often cited in relation to the men. For example, Rob and Ray explain how men avoided charges when police raided their Saturday night suburban parties. Quote, "The Queens were smart enough to know that they had to give their names and addresses, but unless you're caught doing anything, the police couldn't very well prove it. In those days, we used to invite a lot of girls along just to make it look good. It would be different if the police went to a house and it was full of men." Also, the homosexual world of Lee's interviewees were almost exclusively a feature of the dominant white culture. The few instances of Indigenous people are discussed generally concern just one man referred to only as Jeddah, so presumably from the movie of, I think it was the 50s. Jeddah was a sad figure who suicided, and that's probably about as much as we know about him. And it seems that no man of Greek heritage could be homosexual, although he could be enticed to stray over, as Roger A. reminisces about a certain inner city cafe. "The Greek men always had the capacity to like you. The young queens, especially if you're a bit dolly." However, let me expand my commentary on truth and oral history beyond this one particular, albeit groundbreaking, oral history project. It's critical to contextualise not only the particular subject and individual historian, but also to contextualise the prevailing preoccupations and perspectives of the field. In 1995, I presented a paper to the Oral History Association's National Conference, reporting on my research documenting the nexus of sexual and racial identity in Darwin's homosexual culture. Following my presentation, a local Oral History Association member commented to me that it was all very well to record interviews on homosexuality, but one shouldn't discuss them in public. Well, while I doubt that his view was representative of most conference delegates, it raises questions about whose history is legitimate or permissible, and about who exercises influence over the promotion and presentation of history. The index for the Oral History Association's National Journal contains just 2 entries under the subject heading Gay and Lesbian. The first entry, dated 1995, is the expanded paper of my oral history conference presentation, while the second entry, dated 2002, is a paper by another author who questions the lack of gay and lesbian content in the OH, of the Oral History Association's journal. History is also produced for an audience. A big lesson from my first oral history project concerned my decision to present the interviews with as little editing as possible, instead of undertaking, as I could have, a textual analysis presenting my conclusions. I doubt whether today I would make the same decision. For me, the book contains embedded truths about the political tensions evoked through the constructions of identity and community across culture and race. In hindsight, the book's conceptual underpinning and the meta-discourse delivered by the body of interviews should have been explicated for the reader. Almost all of the comments I've received about the book reflect the enjoyment readers found in one particular interview or other. Comment about the book's overarching and, for me, important themes have been comparatively rare. This diversity of factors today is just as relevant. One's interpretation of the homosexual queer culture is influenced by a variety of factors, not least of which include race, cultural background, gender, class, age, and of course, sexual orientation. So this diversity of factors today is just as relevant as it was in the late 1970s when Lee was recording his interviews. Diversity was a key feature in Al Thompson's inspiring lecture last night. It's incumbent upon all of us as creators, controllers and consumers of history to constantly question our assumptions and interpretations. To be here today with this panel and with this audience is a celebration of so much that is laudable in oral history. So to conclude, I wish to say that finding the truth, as with all of life's challenges, is far more problematic, complex, and time-consuming than we ever anticipate. But in this particular field, our undertaking has helped substantially by being able to stand on the shoulders of pioneers such as John Lee. Thank you.